So we are going to begin a few points on the previous Gemara, and then Mitzvah Hashem will start the new parak, the new chapter. We are on page Yud Gimel, Amud Aleph, page 13a, and the Gemara here initially was talking about the mentioning of Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, number one, at night, in addition to during the day, and number two, in the days of the coming of Mashiach, in addition to the nowadays, we will also mention it when Mashiach comes, at least according to the rabbis. And Ben Zoyma did not agree with that. And Ben Zoyma actually brought a pasuk, and the pasuk that Ben Zoyma brought was the pasuk from Isaiah, from Jeremiah, where it says, Lo ye'amru oid chai Hashem. We will not say anymore about that Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim. So it does seem like he has a good source. So the Gemara has to explain that even though there is such a pasuk, but we find similar psukim that also seem to say the same thing. Like by Jacob, it says your name should not be Jacob anymore, and yet even Hashem himself calls him Jacob. So the same type of wording where we have talking about the Exodus from Egypt, we have about Jacob, and we know with Jacob the name doesn't mean that you can't call Yaakov Yaakov, that we're not allowed to call Yaakov anymore Yaakov, but rather we are allowed to call him Yaakov, which is his main name changed to Yisrael. So that's what the Gemara had said as an answer to Ben Zoyma. Again, Ben Zoyma felt that he had a source about not remembering Yetzias Mitzrayim when Mashiach comes, and the Gemara disproves his source and explains why the rabbis hold you do mention Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt. Even when Mashiach comes, we are going to be thanking Hashem for taking us out of Mitzrayim, because we see the same thing as with Yaakov, the same wording in such a verse, and it doesn't mean that we don't call Yaakov anymore. And then the Gemara brought a pasuk in Isaiah about that there are certain things we're not going to remember, and there's other things we're not going to meditate upon. And so the Gemara said one of those talks about Egypt, and the other talks about the other slaveries that we were redeemed from, the other exiles that we were redeemed from. So the one that we don't even mention are the exiles like Yavan, Greek, Bavel, Babylon, Paras, Madai, Persia, Media, and we don't remember those, but we will remember. We just won't meditate on the Exodus from Egypt, but we will remember it. That's a source for the rabbis. So then the Gemara said that the real miracle that we will talk about is the Melchemes Gog uMagog, the war of Gog and Magog, and that is, of course, during the time of the coming of Mashiach. And of course, we don't really know what that refers to, Gog uMagog, but it's basically a war where they're going to fight against Yerushalayim, against Eretz Yisrael, against the Jewish people, and we are going to win. And then the Gemara gave an example. And the example that the Gemara gave would seem to be a proof. It seems the Gemara is trying to prove this same idea that even if you forget something, it doesn't mean you totally forget it. It just means it's not the main topic of your discussion. Does anyone remember the parable? What was the example, the story, the parable that the Gemara gives along the lines of what we are talking about? Miracles, but some miracles some miracles are one way, some miracles are bigger.
I remember.
Yes, Ben.
I remember the man that was walking, and there was as a Ev that attacked him, a wolf, and he got saved. And then he was talking about that always. Then he met a lion, and he was saved again. He was telling the stories about the lion. And the third was the snake. And then he told the snake, but he forgot the other two. He wouldn't talk about the other two anymore. So I think that's the parable that they gave.
So when he spoke about the snake, it was such a big miracle that he was meshakeach, he forgot about the earlier ones. So thank you very much, Ben. Yes, that's correct. So the question is, how does that flow with the previous Gemara? Yes, Robert.
I guess before we go into what you just said, I mean, is there something significant because of it being a snake rather than a different kind of animal in relationship to, again, Gan Eden and what the snake did to Adam and Eve? I mean, is there any inference, or because it's more lowly or whatever it is as a creature? So I just wondered from, from four-legged hairy to the slithering beast, and what there is within any context.
I'm sure there's some connection because everything in Torah is connected somehow.
Somewhere.
But on a simple level, I don't know, unless you want to say that because the snake was cursed, that's why it is a more dangerous animal than the others. Maybe, maybe you could say such a thing. I'm just throwing a thought.
But you're right. You're right. If it's a curse, if it was cursed for its past actions, then it's very symbolic of where it is now in relationship to the other animals.
Maybe that's why it's so much worse, right?
Good idea, Rabbi. Thank you.
Just a thought.
It's a good thought.
Thank you. So this is the meaning.
I think, Rabbi.
I just want to say this is the meaning of the
Rabbi,
idea that
the snake is mentioned. Go ahead.
I was going to say this is the meaning of the idea that your students you learn the most from, because when you ask a question causes the teacher to think a little deeper. Yes, Ben. Why does it say snake?
I was thinking the snake is mentioned many times in the Torah, by Moses in the desert or wherever, and it's always in a negative way. So it's a very negative animal. It's not an animal like the other animals.
Whenever the snake is mentioned, it's always negative. Interesting.
Isn't it true though that one of the tribes, Shevet Dan, aren't they compared to a snake?
Yeah, Nachash alei derech, Shvifain alei yorach, Hanoichech ikvei sus vayipol reich vayachar. Yes, that's right.
So it may not be all negative.
Then he's asking a good question.
But it shows the danger of
negative way too.
That's great. That's great.
Even there, it's mentioned in a negative way. It's going to bite your ankle.
The enemies. Okay, danger, good answer. Yes. Good answer. Yeah. All right. So, in any event, we have this story here, this parable, where there is it seems that the parable is saying that you're going to totally forget the salvations of the past when you're saved from the snake. Like the snake salvation, it'll be meshakles rishonos. Now, the only thing is that doesn't flow with the Gemara. The Gemara is trying to explain the rabbi's view. And the rabbi said that even though the pasuk seems to imply that we will totally forget the Exodus from Egypt, the rabbis say, no, it doesn't mean that. You really will remember the Exodus from Egypt. You just don't make it'll be a secondary point. You'll mention it, but it won't be the main focus of our praises of Hashem, but it will still be mentioned. That's what the Gemara is trying to prove. And then the Gemara brings this parable. So it's obviously looking to explain that even if you have a bigger miracle, you don't totally forget the earlier miracles, but you just don't make such a big deal out of them. So therefore, we have to explain that that's the meaning of this brisa in order for it to flow. That the brisa, I'm sorry, this parable, this mushal, this parable is the emphasis is that even though the miracle of the snake is a much bigger miracle, and it is going to cause you to somewhat minimize or not speak so much about, you won't be elaborating on the miracle of the lion and the wolf, but you will still remember it, and you'll still, it'll still be thought about and acknowledged. And that's really what the brisa means, that even though it says the word mashakos, but it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean you totally forget it. It means it'll be less significant because of you have such other tremendous miracles. So, and then the Gemara continues with the Avram hu Avraham. And it explains that there's a verse in Divrei Hayomim that says Avram is the same as Avraham. Now, if we want, one way of learning this Gemara is that the Gemara is continuing with this idea that Avram and Avraham are both names, even though Hashem changed the name to Avraham, but he's still called Avram.
It's a nickname.
Avram was his earlier name, and Avraham is the new name. And the Gemara is continuing with that idea in this brisa. In other words, it's a continuation, and it's saying that Avram is Avraham, and at first he was called Av to Aram, and then afterwards he became the Av to Kol Ha'olam Kulai, and Sarai is also Sarah. And first she was Sarai to her nation, and now she's Sarah to the whole world. And so it's a continuation as well, that you have earlier names and later names, earlier happenings, later happenings, and both of them they're not totally forgotten. And you see that from the fact that in Divrei Hayomim, in the books of the Chronicles, which is the one of the later books of the Tanakh, it mentions the name Avram. Now you have the next Gemara, and it says, Tani Bar Kapara learned that whoever calls Avraham Avram, he transgresses an aseh, a positive commandment. Rabbi Eliezer says he transgresses a negative commandment also. And so this is looking at the Gemara this way. What it comes out is that there are two opposing views here. In other words, I didn't develop this. I didn't put emphasis on this on Friday when we learned it. But if you take the flow of the earlier Gemara and you fit it in with all the pieces, with all the continuation of that flow, you have an idea that Avram is also a name of Avraham, and it's just not emphasized as much. It's not brought out. You have the story, you have the parable where you did get saved from the wolf and the lion. You're just not emphasizing it. We have the story of Yaakov and the name Yaakov and Yisrael, where Yisrael is the main name and Yaakov is more of a secondary name. We have the story of Mitzrayim, Yitzias Mitzrayim, versus the other salvations. One is the main, one is the emphasis and the emphasis is, of course, Melchemes Gog uMagog, but we will still mention Yitzias Mitzrayim. So, if you follow that flow, then you come to this Gemara. It turns out that this Gemara is actually arguing on the previous Gemara. So what you see is how careful you have to be when you read it. We could have just read it straight through and not realize this way of understanding it. According to this, it turns out that it's an argument. If you call Avraham Avram, Are you transgressing? Are you doing a sin? This is a strong question. And the reason I make a big deal out of this is not only because it's the translation of the Gemara, but it's one of the big questions that the commentaries ask is why don't the codifiers of Jewish law, why don't they bring down this halacha that you're not allowed to call Avraham Avram? Why don't they mention it? Person should be careful to not say Avram. You should say Avraham. When you speak about Avraham, you should make sure to call him Avraham, and so on. Why don't the codifiers of Jewish law mention it? Why is it not brought in the Rambam? It's not brought in the Shulchan Aruch, and it's not, it's not mentioned in halacha. Why not? So according to the way we just learned the Gemara, you have an answer. What's the answer? There's two opinions in the Gemara. There's two opinions. The first Gemara implied that there's no problem. The second Gemara says it's a sin, it's a transgression of a negative commandment, a positive commandment. That's the second piece. That's the second opinion. But the earlier opinion says it's not a problem. We even have a pasuk in Divrei Hayamim, in the pasuk in Chronicles. It says Avram and it says Avraham in the same verse. Avram is Avraham. So you see, it's not a problem. You could call him Avram. That's what it's. That's the earlier Gemara. So later Gemara says it's a problem. So the codifiers don't paskin that way because it's not an accepted. It's not 100% accepted among all. It's not the final conclusion, and that is one way of learning, one way of answering this problem of why the codifiers don't mention this halacha. Yes, Robert.
I guess the question for me is, going forward, through contemporary times, again, it's Abraham and it's Sarah. So clearly that is what has been set as the precedent in calling them. So I just, I understand this, there are two conflicting interpretations, but clearly over the ages, the names Abraham and Sarah have stuck. So obviously there is a trend of acceptance, even though it's not codified. I guess that's the way that I can interpret it.
Right. Well, the earlier Gemara, which would be the source that it's not a problem to say Avram, is not saying that Avram is the main name. It's only set. It is considering it secondary, and it's similar to what the flow of the Gemara is saying. So it's not surprising.
It's not right. It was his original identity, but he is evolved, or it is evolved to Abraham.
Right.
So that's recognition. Part of it is for me is this recognition of the past. As I keep reading, I see that there's a logical progression that we, as then the Hebrews, are going forward. And as we do that, it's clearly setting the path for where we're going by having her call Sarah for time immemorial, time going forward, and Abraham. And so, and Jacob and Israel, again, are part of our language is Israel and the significance of Israel in the future of the Jewish people, metaphorically, in any case.
Right, for sure. Yes, Ben.
I want you to say there is a difference between Abraham and Sarah and Jacob, because Jacob got a whole new name.
Right.
Abraham and Sarah just got modified by one letter.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not as serious as Jacob, which got a complete new name.
That is interesting. It deserves some thought. Yeah.
So comparing it to Egypt and the other galuyot is more similar to Jacob, not to Abraham and Sarah.
You have to ask on this one.
That is interesting that you mentioned that.
And the other galuyot is completely different.
Okay, that is interesting. Yes, Robert.
Something haunts me, and I'm sorry for bringing it in, but when the Nazis identified us,
Yep.
men and women who were Jewish. Every man had the middle name of Jacob, and every woman had the middle name of Sarah. So
Really?
again, yeah. So that's
Oh my God.
that's part of the irony. I have, you can see it there. Whenever you see the lists of Jews, they'll always are on their passports with a big J on their German passport. Every male middle name was Jacob, and every woman was Sarah. That was
So
again,
interesting.
yeah. So it's
How
ironic
interesting.
that has happened.
Rabbi, can you hear
Yes.
me? It's Moshe.
Yeah. Moshe.
What I wanted to find out is, wasn't he called Abraham after he was circumcised
Okay.
in
Good.
Mamre? Because
Right.
so it is a transgression to be called Avram after he's been circumcised. Am I correct?
But why? Why are you bringing that? Why are you emphasizing that? That because he was
No,
circumcised?
because
I mean,
it's as though they're referring to him as Avram. It's a Goyish name. It's a non-Jewish. It's a transgression from his move towards being more Jewish. You understand what I'm saying? I mean, it's doesn't seem logical, to call him Avram after he's been circumcised.
Uh-huh. So what you're saying is actually very, very nice insight. It's mentioned. I just wanted you to develop it a little clearer, because what you're saying is mentioned in the Tosfos Harosh. So very, very nice that you came up with it. Tosfos Harosh asks a question. He says, why doesn't the Torah call Avraham afterwards Avram? Why not? Just like, with Jacob, the Torah goes back and forth. Why didn't the Torah do it to Avraham? And the Torah, in the Tosfos Harosh answers that because Avraham was changed when he was circumcised, he became Jewish. So if you call him Avram, you're embarrassing him, reminding, so to speak, the idea that he wasn't Jewish, which is a very derogatory thing to do. It's not nice to remind someone of their past, so to speak. You're bringing up the past and bringing up the name that he had before he was Jewish. So very good point, Moshe. So that's the explanation of the Tosfos Harosh, which would be a reason why we shouldn't call him that either, I guess. But the Tosfos Harosh uses it as a question: why didn't Hashem call him it afterwards? And the reason is because of that, because of he wasn't Jewish before, and that was the name he had when he wasn't Jewish. So thank you. Yeah, good point. Okay, so now I will also mention that there is a very long Magen Avraham. There's a very long commentary on the Shulchan Aruch in chapter 156, where it talks about the mitzvah of going to work. After you daven and you learn Torah, you got to go to work, and that's a law in Shulchan Aruch. It's in chapter 156. Seder Masa Umaton. The laws, the order of going to work. It says afterwards, first it talked about going to the Beis HaKnesses, to the Beis HaMedrash, and now it says afterwards you got to go to work, because Torah that doesn't have work, it ends up being batel. It ends up being you end up stopping, and it causes sin, because poverty causes a person to go crazy. And but you shouldn't make your work the main thing. It should be temporary. Your Torah should be the main thing. And there's a whole beautiful laws about how a person should work with honesty and so on. Now, on this chapter of the Code of Law, so the Magen Avraham, who's one of the main commentaries on this part of the Shulchan Aruch, so he has one of his longest sections, and in it, he mentions a lot of different interesting things about life, and he says you should connect yourself with the Talmidei Chachamim, with scholars and students, in order to learn from their ways. Mitzvah on every yid to love every other yid. You have a mitzvah of v'ahavta l'recha kamoicha. And what happens if a person is a sinner? Do you still have a mitzvah to love him? It touches upon this in Tanya, chapter 32. And he speaks about helping out a sinner in order to force your evil inclination, that you shouldn't have total hatred, and so on. He speaks about numerous things, honoring, enjoying the embarrassment of your friend. You don't get a portion in the world to come. Loving a convert who, there's 2 mitzvahs, and if a person hates another yid in his heart, it's a negative commandment. Person hits another yid, it's a prohibition of not to hit, but it's not a prohibition of hatred because you didn't keep it in your heart. And it talks about that what you should do if someone did something wrong to you, you should say it to them, and you should tell them, why did you do this to me? But don't embarrass them. But you should be quiet. It should be done in privacy and privately. And he continues with it's prohibited to count another yid. People should stick out their fingers into count. You should count the fingers instead of counting another yid. And he talks about if it's when your person is allowed to lie. Normally, of course, it's a prohibition to lie, but there are examples where it is permissible. And talks about the prohibition of lashon hara, rebuking people. You have to be careful about yasaimim and almanos, dealing being respectful, and being careful not to hurt a orphan or a widow, even if they're very wealthy. And then he goes to he speaks about the lashon hara, a lot about lashon hara. Then he talks about taking revenge, and then he mentions a person who calls Avram, he gets a transgression of a positive commandment and a negative commandment. So interesting that he brings here this prohibition. So the Magen Avram, although I mentioned that it's not brought in the code of law, there is one opinion in code of law that brings it down. Much later than the Shulchan Aruch was written, but later, there's a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, but he actually brings down this law that a person should not call Avraham Avram. So there is such a source in the code of law. Okay, and there is one other thing. What else I wanted to mention? The Yerushalmi here, he brings
Rabbi
down,
Smith.
Yes.
Rabbi Smith, I'd be interested to know which 2 mitzvahs he leaves off. If he includes those 2 as mitzvahs, which are the 2 mitzvahs which are left off that everybody else is including?
Oh, see, he doesn't count this is the thing. There's 2 parts to the mitzvahs. One is which mitzvahs are counted and which ones aren't counted, even though they're obligations. So there are many mitzvahs, but the Rambam doesn't necessarily count them in the 613, not because you're not obligated to do them, but because of various reasons, general mitzvahs, and there's like numerous. So the fact that he considers it a prohibition and a positive mitzvah, it doesn't mean he's counting it in the 248 and the 365. You know what I mean? It's like he's not giving a count of the mitzvah. He's just telling you it's a prohibition. He's bringing it from our Gemara. His source is our Gemara, that it clearly says it's prohibited. But it doesn't mean that necessarily he's going to consider that one of the 365 negative commandments and one of the 248 positive. At least that's my understanding. Yes, Robert.
I'm just curious, will we be having a session sometime understanding the number of mitzvot there are and sort of their ranking? I should sort of be interested in that.
If you stay with me long enough,
We'll cover everything, right?
listen, if we're doing a blot a week in 49 years, I hope to finish the shop.
Can of horror. There we go. Thanks.
So the Jerusalem Talmud brings down, he says, why is Abraham and Jacob's name changed and Yitzchak's is not changed? So the Jerusalem Talmud says, because their fathers called them by those original names, so Hashem changed it. But Yitzchak, Hashem called him Yitzchak, and therefore he didn't change it. So that's a interesting point. And while we're talking about changing of the names, and Abraham's name changed, Yaakov's name was changed, but Yitzchak's is not changed. And according to this view, it means that Yaakov's name was received. Yaakov's name was from his parents. I believe there might be a question about that. There might be other sources but the Yerushalmi here says that it's Yitzchak's name was not changed, but because Hashem called him Yitzchak, but the others were called by their parents, their names. Okay.
Rabbi Smith,
yes.
I was also thinking before you mentioned about Yitzchak that sometimes you have great Talmidei Chachamim or rabbis that are named Yitzchak Isaac. It seems to be like that there's that not only the Yitzchak but even the Isaac is holy. For some, you know what I'm saying? I'm trying to. I'll let you run with the implication that I'm making. I think.
I'm not sure what you're saying. Maybe you're saying that it's common for Yitzchak to be connected with Isaac,
right?
I'm
and
not
it's
really
almost
sure.
like it's almost like an extra name. Like it's part of Yitzchak is Isaac, and you don't see anybody named Avraham, or but Yitzchak or Sarah, but you see Yitzchak Isaacs. So they're
But you also see people by the name of Ze'ev Wolf.
Wolf, right?
So that has
Mendel.
Right.
It's just, has nothing. I don't think the two of them have any connection at all.
Dove Bear.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Fine.
Right.
So, but that doesn't mean that the two of them are holy. It just means that, you have the Hebrew name and you have the non-Hebrew name.
Right.
Right. I once asked the Rav if I once asked like a posek, a person who gives like verdicts in Jewish law. I told him that my name is Menachem, and I was thinking, I had a thought to name one of my kids Mendel, because they can't, I wanted to name one of my kids after the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So he told me you can't do it, because Menachem is the same name as Mendel, just one is Yiddish.
Oh.
Now, I don't know if every rabbi would agree with that, but that was what the Rav who I asked, he gave that verdict, so I followed it. But it's along the lines of what you're saying with Yitzchak and Isaac. I guess the same would apply, and maybe Dov Ber and Zev Wolf and so on. But I think the double names, it just had to do with adding a Yiddish name, which became like a very unique language, Yiddish. It was a language. It has some special element to it that Yiddish,
the language unto the Jews. The language unto the Jews. It's our language.
But it's hard to say it because you have Hebrew, like how to, but there is a whole sikha from the Rebbe about Yiddish language and Yiddish. But anyway, it deserves more thought, and it deserves a class of its own. Yes, Ben.
I wanted to say that in Europe, all the names were in both languages. You had Arya Leib, you had Tzvi Hirsch, you had every name had both had the translation. And some of them were a little different, like Yaakov would be Yankele or something, so Yanko.
Right. Okay, so
the same name just sound differently.
Right.
Rabbi Smith.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I had a similar question when I named my son, because my father's name was Mendel, and he was still alive at the time. And I asked the Rav, which was Rabbi David Shochet in Toronto, what am I supposed to do? I would like to name my son Menachem Mendel, but my father's name is Mendel. He said, "Well, the Sephardim can do that," but I said, "Well, I like Sephardim." He says it doesn't go like that. He says you can use Menachem, but you can't use the Mendel. So I named my son Menachem. And
I should have asked him my
But
question.
it is the same. It is the same in Yiddish and Hebrew, yeah.
Anyway, very interesting. It could be that there's a difference, because it could be that just to name after someone else is not a problem, as long as it's not exactly the same name. If they're alive, it could be it's a different story.
Right, and the Sephardi
I don't know.
named the children after themselves while they're still alive. Well, we don't as Ashkenazis, so it's interesting.
Right. Anyway, I don't know. I'm not sure. It's interesting. Could be Mendel and Menachem versus Menachem and Mendel. Maybe there's a difference there. I don't know. Okay. Anyway, the Gemara that we started here, we just mentioned that that this opinion argues on the previous opinion, and this Gemara, the final Gemara, was following the view that you can't call Avraham Avram. And the Gemara then talks about the fact that what about Sarai and what about Yaakov? And it says Sarai, it only is a prohibition on Avraham to call her Sarai, but it's not a prohibition on the Klal Yisrael to call her Sarai. And what about Yaakov? And the Gemara says that the pasuk itself says Yaakov, and so therefore it obviously doesn't mean to prohibit it completely. So the question is, so why is it that Avraham is prohibited? Why are we prohibited from calling Avraham Avram and not the Sarai, and Yaakov, Yisrael Yaakov? Yes, Ben.
I wanted to say Yaakov was Jewish when he was named Yaakov, and he was Jewish when he was named Israel. Avraham was not, apparently.
Say that one more time.
So maybe that's the prohibition, like the man before said. Avraham was called Avraham after he became Jewish. So before that, he was a goy.
Right.
Yaakov was a Jew in both cases. That's why you're allowed to call him that.
Good point. That's a great point, actually. Right. So could be that could be an explanation that this would be a difference.
One of my previous rabbis, his daughter's name was Sarai. And I was always was, questioning why wasn't she called Sarah, but her name was Sarai. So I thought that was interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah. I guess he was trying to show, the Gemara says it's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Right.
Some people like to prove, to do things unique.
Well, also reminds
that it's right.
of history, of, the history of Sarah.
Right. So the Maharsha here, he has an explanation, and he says that Avraham's name was changed, and that was in order to give him Yitzchak. That was when his name was changed. Now, before that, when he was brought outside by Yotzei Hachutza. Hashem took him outside. All that was changed was in order for him to have Yishmael. And after he was the Av to Aram, which means he was the Avram, stands for Av to Aram, which our Gemara says. So it means that he was like a father to that nation. And then he had Yishmael, he was like a father to Yishmael, another nation. And then when he was his name changed, that was in order that he should have Yitzchak, and he'll now be called Av Hamoin Goyim. He's now going to be called the father of many nations. Now, what is the meaning of father of many nations? So the way the Maharsha explains, it means that he's now the father of all the tribes. Each tribe is called a nation, as we find later. Goyu Kahal Goyim, that every tribe is called a nation. So when Hashem promised Avram he'll be the father of many nations, the way the Maharsha is explaining it is that he's going to be the father of all of the tribes. And that was because he's going to give birth to Yitzchak. He's going to impregnate his wife, give birth to Yitzchak, and Yitzchak's going to have Yaakov and then the tribes. And so he's going to be the father of many nations. And so now the change of the name Sarah is also that initially she was only going to be my princess or my mine. Her nation will recognize her, and that would only apply when she was alive. But when she would die, her memory would be forgotten if she didn't have any kids. And then when her name was changed to Sarah, her mazel changed, that she'll have children and she'll be Sarah to the whole world, along the same lines of that she'll be the mother of all the tribes. And therefore, Yaakov is called Yisrael also for that idea, so that the same idea of being a sar. Now, it says that if a person calls Avram's name was removed and Avram was changed to Avraham, but Yaakov is only Tafel, it's only secondary. And the reason is that Avraham, when Hashem told him, I want you to be called Avraham, it was only because Avraham was satisfied with his son Yishmael. And when it says Avram, he was the father of Aram, that would mean that he's not going to have a child that will inherit him. And Hashem said, I want you to remove that entire name because that will limit your power and ability to draw down energy from Hashem to be the father of many nations. So the change of the name by Avraham was a necessity, because if he wouldn't have changed his name, it would have caused that he would have only been the father of Aram. He would not have any descendants. His name needed to be changed in order to be able to have Yershim, descendants. In other words, Yitzchak. But the change of the name of Yaakov was only about chashivos, importance. And therefore, it's not a problem to call him by the earlier name. And even though the earlier name is maybe a more humble name, Akev, the heel, but it's not a problem. The change of the name of Sarah is, it's not a problem to call her Sarai, because she didn't have any kids. Avram had a child, Yishmael, and he wanted Yishmael that he's good enough. And therefore, he alone has this command that don't use the name Avram and you can't use the name Sarai. So in other words, Avraham is commanded, you can't use the name Sarai, and we can't use the name Avram. Why? Because the whole emphasis is that Avraham needs to be, we can't bring back the idea of Avram, which would be limiting Avraham's involvement with the entire world and limiting him to not be connected, not to have Yitzchak, limiting him not to have his Yoresh, his inheritor, and giving him power that it's Yishmael is good enough. Now, in order for Avram to know that Yishmael is not good enough, Hashem made Avraham has to call Sarai Sarah, because he has to emphasize that she is the source of Avraham being the father of all nations is from his wife, Sarah, not from Hagar. She is the source that he's going to be the father of all nations. So the Maharsha sort of like gives us a little a deeper explanation of what why certain names were okay to be called and why Avraham was limited to call Sarai only Sarah, and why Hashem Davka wanted Avram, why specifically Avraham was not allowed to be called Avram. And it's all connected to the idea that Avraham was satisfied with Yishmael. He wanted Yishmael to be his future. And Hashem said, no, absolutely not. It's going to be Yitzchak. It's going to be the specific descendants of Yitzchak, Yaakov and his children. They're going to be your future. And Hashem made sure that that's clear by removing the name Avram, which Avram meant like it gave the implication that maybe Yishmael would be good enough, that would be that would be okay. And Hashem said, no, none of that. Removing the entire thought of Avram being a father to Aram and being like a father of a nation. No, that's totally not you. We're not allowing Yishmael to have any say and give any importance to Yishmael being the future. And therefore Hashem said that you're not allowed to call him Avram. It has to be Avraham. And Avraham, you have to call your wife Sarah, because you have to emphasize that she is going to be the source of you being the father of all the nations. You have to emphasize that, realize that it's from her, not from your other wife, Hagar. So that gives a little deeper, a little more explanation to this discussion here in the Gemara. And
Rabbi?
Yes.
I attended a shiur some years ago where it was stated that Abraham Avinu had said when he learned, of his destiny initially, because he could see in the stars that he wasn't originally supposed to have any kids, and he said, "Sayoti miahid tognanuchali, get me out of this destiny." This was before. So I guess this is before his name was changed to Abraham. I think it was also before he had Ishmael. Am I correct?
So there were two stages, the way the Maharsha explains it, there were two stages in changing his mazel. The first stage made him able to give birth to impregnate Hagar to have Yishmael. And the second stage of the mazel changing was that he was now going to be able to impregnate Sarah and have many nations. So it was two different parts of changing his mazel. Okay, so the conclusion of the Gemara was that even though we say in the davening, we use the word Avram, but really over there, it's just emphasizing that Avraham's name initially was Avram, and you chose him when he was still. You chose him even early when he was still Avram, and you made his name Avraham. And so that's why we're allowed to say it, and that's why it's in a pasuk there, and where we say it in the davening, because it's not calling Avraham Avram, we're just saying that Hashem chose him when his name was Avram, but we're not calling him Avram. Hashem chose him when his name was Avram. And that is the conclusion of this paragraph. I should mention one more thing, and that is that the Maritz Chayes says that the reason why it's not brought in Shulchan Aruch, the name of the prohibition of calling Avram, is because that was a law that was given before the giving of the Torah. And there are examples where when Hashem gave certain laws before the giving of the Torah, that those laws didn't apply later on. When we got to Torah, we follow only things that are in the Torah and any traditions that we have, but the laws that were applicable before the giving of the Torah, they sort of were overridden by the laws of the Torah. So this was a law that was given before the giving of the Torah. So when Hashem gave the Torah to us, we sort of were on a new level where the Torah is the source of all of our mitzvahs and not the mitzvahs before. It's discussed a lot. This idea is discussed a lot when we talk about the mitzvah of circumcision. Are we circumcising ourselves because Hashem gave the mitzvah at Sinai, or are we circumcising ourselves because Hashem gave the mitzvah to Avraham to circumcise himself? So that is discussed there at length, because the bracha seems to imply like we're doing it, connecting it to Avraham. When a father circumcises his son or hires a moil to circumcise his son, he says a bracha. And the bracha he says is the bracha that mitzvahs of Itzivanu lachnisoi bevrisoi shel Avraham Avinu, that Hashem commanded us to bring him in the bris, to enter him in the treaty of Avraham Avinu. So from the bracha, it sounds almost like you're following the mitzvah that Hashem gave to Avraham. But we know that we don't follow mitzvahs that were given to Avraham. We follow mitzvahs that were given at Sinai. So you have to, the way they explain the bracha is that it's connected to the bris of Avraham, but it's of course because Hashem commanded it to us at Sinai. So in other words, there's some connection to Avraham. It's along the same line, but it's not because of Avraham's mitzvah. So that same idea would apply here with the prohibition of calling Avraham Avram, which doesn't apply maybe nowadays because it was given before Matan Torah.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Does that mean that people were not all circumcising their Jewish boys even when we were in Mitzrayim? I thought, that after the Brit Bein HaBetarim, that every descendant of Avraham Avinu is to be circumcised, the male.
So
the 8th day.
Until the Torah was given, they followed this law. But once the Torah was given, we took on a new covenant of the Torah. And that's where all of our obligations come from. In other words, it's all about connecting to Hashem, and connecting to Hashem on a much more powerful level after the giving of the Torah. So that's why we're involved with the mitzvahs after the giving of the Torah versus the commandments of before the giving of the Torah, which were not in the same league because we didn't connect with the physical world, which happened with the giving of the Torah. We were able to connect more to the physical world. And so the mitzvah is that all the mitzvahs that were before the giving of the Torah aren't really applicable once the Torah was given, and we have the Torah is the source of the entire Yiddishkeit. But before that, they did follow those laws to some extent, the laws they were obligated, obviously.
So what they were doing was reasserted with a deeper spiritual implication.
That's right. But there was, what we see here is there might have been one law that was dropped, and that would have been the prohibition to call Avram. According to the Maritz Chayes, there were laws. There was one example here where there's a law that was actually not repeated. It wasn't repeated at the giving of the Torah. So it's something interesting. I wonder if there are other laws like that they can give as other examples. We'll have to keep our eyes open. Okay, we only have 4 minutes left, so I do want to start, as I committed to. We're going to start the next chapter, so
Chapter 2.
we will do it. We are on page Yud Gimel, page 13a. Yes, Howard, did you want to say something, Howard? 13a.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm all right, thank you.
Okay, chapter 2. Haya koire b'Torah. If a person was reading the Torah, the portion of Shema, v'higia zman hamikra, in the time of Kriya Shema had arrived. And so now he's really studying. He's doing it as part of his study. He's reading and learning Torah. So does he fulfill his obligation of saying the Shema? So the Mishnah says, Im kivein liboy, if he has in mind to fulfill the mitzvah by reciting the Shema, he's going to know, he has in mind that he's going to fulfill the mitzvah. Yotza, he is yotze, he has fulfilled his obligation. Now, the question is, what does this mean? He's reading the Torah, and the problem is that where is the Shema written in the Torah? So you got the portion of Vayomer is written in Parsha Shlach. You have the portion of Shema is written in the portion of Voschanan. The portion of the portion Vahayam Shamaya is written in Akev. So how was he reading the Shema, and was he reading it in the wrong order? He was reading Parshas Shlach, seemingly he was reading Parsha Shlach, and he came up to Vayomer. So what you see here is that you can fulfill the mitzvah of Shema if you read the portions, the paragraphs in the wrong order. Now, this might not apply to verses. If you read the verses in the wrong order or words in the wrong order, you didn't fulfill your obligation. But here we're talking about you switched around the paragraphs. You did this paragraph first, you did that paragraph after, that you could fulfill your obligation, even though it's not in the right order. And so it depends on your intent. If you fulfill the mitzvah, you need to have kavana, you need to have the right intention that you're going to fulfill the mitzvah. If you're just reading it or saying stuff and you happen to have said the Shema, but example, I guess the example would be also in Shul, if they pull out the Sefer Torah and they do the Shema Yisrael, and they're doing the Shema, and you said that with the congregation, did you fulfill your obligation of saying the first verse of Shema or not? Really depends. If you had in mind that let's say you came late to Shul, you didn't say Shema yet, and they're now pulling out the Sefer Torah and they're doing the Shema. So if you say that with the congregation, you could just continue with Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusai and V'ahavta. You could just continue if you have in mind, because you had in mind, even though you're saying it with the congregation for a different reason, but you're also having in mind for the mitzvah of Shema, and then just continue with Baruch Shem Kavod. So this is the mitzvah of Shema. It needs to have kavana, and you could fulfill the mitzvah even though you had in mind you're doing something else. Another example is where you're writing you're a cipher, you're a scribe, and you're writing, and every time when you write, you say the words before you write. So you say, Shema, and then you write Shema, Yisrael, and you write Yisrael. And so you're saying each word. It depends. If you have in mind to fulfill the mitzvah of Shema while you're writing it, then you could fulfill the mitzvah of Shema while you're writing, while you're a scribe and you're writing the Torah. Okay, Mitzvah Hashem, we will see you either later today or tomorrow. Have a wonderful day.